everyone, and welcome. I'm Rebecca Middleton, the Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at the World Food Program USA. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Chase Sova, who's the Senior Director of Public Policy and Research. The World Food Program USA is a 501c3 nonprofit that supports the mission of the United Nations World Food Program in the United States through advocacy, fundraising, and brand building. One of the things we do as well is advance important conversations related to the World Food Program's work to help our supporters understand some of the complexity and nuance of the issues around WFP. So we're here today to dive into one of those conversations. Chase is going to talk to us about a new report he's written called Dangerously Hungry, and it's on the nexus of conflict and hunger. So Chase, turn it over to you to just tell us a little bit about the outlines of the report and the idea behind it.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be with you here today. It's always nice to have a conversation with you. We do it every day, but it's nice to do it in front of the camera. We launched Dangerously Hungry as a follow-on to a report that we had launched in 2017 called Winning the Peace, Hunger and Instability. And I think, the justification for looking at a topic like this, which is food-related instability, is that for years and years, I think we've known anecdotally that there's this relationship between food insecurity and conflict. We work on Capitol Hill a lot, and you used to hear people like Senator Pat Roberts say, show me a nation that can't feed itself, and I'll show you a nation in chaos. So I think we sort of intuitively knew that there was this link between food insecurity and conflict, but we had to bring that from the realm of the anecdotal into something that was research-based. And that's really what we did back in 2017 with Winning the Peace. And you remember where we were at that time, right? It was the time of the four famines. It was the beginning of the Trump administration. We were looking at potential cuts to foreign affairs spending and food assistance spending more specifically. We've always known that when you have a conflict event or war, that the natural outcome of that is poverty and hunger. That's happened in every major conflict in the history of humankind. But what we don't talk a lot about is the inverse, the ways that food insecurity itself drives instability. And that's really what we looked at in the original Winning the Peace report and in this new report, Dangerously Hungry. So what was really interesting about this project is back in 2017, when we started this, we looked at research on food-related instability dating back to the early 1990s. And in that period, from the early 1990s to 2017, we came up with about 53 articles, peer-reviewed academic work that spoke to the relationship between food insecurity and instability. When we revisited this work from 2017 to present day, we found a much larger body of work that we could draw from. So we ended up with 60 studies in our final report that are in the Dangerously Hungry report. But the world of academic literature to draw from had grown dramatically. When we insert keywords into academic databases related to food-related instability, we did that in 2017. We came up with about 3,000 results. Today, when we do the same thing, we come up with 8,000. So what's unique about this report is that we have gone through all 8,000 of those peer-reviewed academic works, and our research team has identified those 60 studies, and we present that information very clearly to the reader in Dangerously Hungry. And it's best, I think, to think about this report as a study of studies, right? It's a systematic review. We're trying to canvass everything that's been produced on this topic over the last 5 years. So the document itself is broken down into key drivers of food-related instability and key individual motivators of food-related instability.
So Chase, you mentioned that the volume of research in the last 5 years leading up to Dangerously Hungry is much more significant than it was leading up to the original report. Can you talk a little bit about what's changed in the last 5 years and sort of what you infer has been the driver of that increase in publication?
Yeah, of course. Well, one thing is that food-related instability is just on the radar in public circles in a way that it wasn't in the past. When we did Winning the Peace back in 2017, researchers were looking at food-related instability because of the 2007-2008 food price crises. In that period, we saw protests and riots in about 40 different nations tied directly to food prices. So you did see this flurry of research from the academic community around food price riots specifically. And that's really what's captured in Winning the Peace. What's happened since then is we've had a whole lot more attention paid to the use of food as a weapon of war, for example. And that's driven a whole new body of research. So a couple things in that space. One is the UN Security Council passed a resolution called 2417, which condemns globally the use of food as a weapon of war. After that, we saw the US Congress, both the Senate and the House, pass similar resolutions condemning use of food as a weapon of war. And we've also seen WFP awarded the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize, which looked specifically at the ways that food insecurity was driving conflict, but also the ways that food assistance could produce these peace dividends, right? So the world is suddenly talking more and more, and the attention is more focused on food-related instability and the use of food as a weapon of war. Now, when we go into the research specifically, and you look into these 60 studies that comprise the Dangerously Hungry report, there are a couple new trends. One is that we've got a better understanding of the way that rebel groups recruit based on desperation. So, for example, we see that ISIS is providing refugees almost $1,000 in certain settings to join their movement. If you have nothing and someone offers you seemingly everything, you're very likely to make a decision you wouldn't have otherwise made. If you cannot feed yourself or your family, then you're very likely to be taken to take up one of these opportunities. It's called the opportunity cost theory in the research and in the report. That is a big part of what we've learned since the last Winning the Peace report, and there's more examples in this report of that sort of activity. The second thing I think that's really interesting is that we're learning more about agricultural abundance and how that can drive conflict. Now, we know that the World Food Program and other humanitarian organizations are always working in settings of scarcity, right? We're there because people can't afford food, they can't access food, but there are always pockets of agricultural productivity that can be exploited by rebel groups in particular who are trying to fuel their rebellions. And so sometimes you get commodity cropping areas that are taken over by rebel organizations to try to gain access to those export earnings. Other times you'll have just primary foods that people are needing to consume, sorghum, maize, millet, these sorts of things, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where rebel groups at first cooperate with communities, but then later turn on communities in a coercive way when they need access to those resources and can't otherwise find them. So agricultural abundance in a sea of scarcity can lead to conflict. So we're seeing that in the literature. The other thing is that there has been a huge amount of researchers focusing on climate change impacts on global security and instability. And some of the best studies and most important studies of climate-related security run through food systems. So it's very obvious if you have drought, you have precipitation changes, temperature changes, most of those things, the first and frontline impacts are going to be on agricultural systems, right? It's going to be crop loss, yield loss, all of these things. And all of that eventually leads to downstream impacts on resource competition and economic shocks. So it's really important body of work that has developed a lot over the last couple of years. About 50% of the studies in Dangerously Hungry begin with analysis of some sort of climate-related stressor. And they move towards different types of instability that arise from that through the food system. So that's an interesting development. You know, I think on the other side of things, we are learning a little bit more about the use of food as a weapon of war. There have been a lot of developments on the international level. We've talked about 2417, we've talked about what the US government has done in this regard, but we still have so many unanswered questions about how to hold people accountable when people are denied access to food. What does international humanitarian law say about that? What does international human rights law say about that? We frankly don't have a lot of answers right now. We don't know when we can go and say an individual, a government, some entity is responsible. And how do you litigate that? And those are the biggest challenges that we're facing on that front, but we do see a little bit more of this in Dangerously Hungry as that debate has advanced. So really, it's an incredibly important time to be looking at food-related instability. Not only is there more research, but the food insecurity problem has gotten much worse over the past 5 years. When we wrote Winning the Peace, 5 years ago, we had 4 famines, right? And that was dominating headlines. Since then, the number of people in crisis levels of hunger around the world have increased pretty dramatically, right? With the events of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the lingering impacts of COVID-19 and its impacts on global hunger, food prices being at 15 and 20-year highs, now is the time to be looking at food-related instability in a closer way.
So let's talk about the report itself and what the audience will find when they go on our website, wfpusa.org, and looks at the report. I know you mentioned earlier that part of what you found that there were 3 primary drivers of food-related instability. Talk a little bit about those.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting about this report and the previous report is that I think, frankly, and this might just be the nerd in me, but the most important part of this document is the annex, right? It's what you're going to see when you've read the entire report. What we've done with Dangerously Hungry is to give readers access to the key findings from 60 peer-reviewed studies on food-related instability. So I encourage people to look at that. I think it's going to be a resource. Last time when we wrote the Winning the Peace report, Winning Peace was really important to academics, think tanks, and others it was involved in, got incorporated into university curriculums, precisely because of the depth of information that we provided and the detailed access, sort of privileged access to some of these peer-reviewed studies that document provided. So what you're going to find in the report, though, now in Dangerously Hungry is the first section is going to be looking at specific drivers of food-related instability. So what happened is our team went through these 8,000 articles. We got to our 60 core articles, and then we coded those articles. When was it produced? What was the geography of the study? What was the main drivers of hunger in those situations? And what type of instability was produced? Was it riots and protests? Was it terrorism? Was it civil war? You do that over and over again, and you start to tell a story about the literature. And where we are today with this is really you can group this into 3 main buckets, these 60 studies. First bucket is climate change. Second bucket is economic shocks. And the third is competition over natural resources. So in just one example, in the climate change research, we saw one group of researchers look at temperature changes during critical growing seasons in sub-Saharan Africa between 1970 and 2012 and found that increases in temperature in critical growing seasons had a pretty remarkable impact on the likelihood of civil conflict. Now, when you extend those results forward based on likely temperature increases in the region, they expect to see about a 30% increase in civil conflict in sub-Saharan Africa as a result. We've also had people look at precipitation, right, where you see a drop in precipitation in critical growing phases, leading to the instance of civil war increasing by about 2 or 3%. So that doesn't seem like a lot, but it is a big impact when you consider how sizable an event that civil war is. So those are 2 studies in the climate space that I think are worth referencing, and you'll find that in the Dangerously Hungry report. The second bucket is economic shocks. And this is where we see a lot of the literature from 2007 and 2008 and the food price crisis. A lot of that was covered in the original Winning the Peace report, but we do have some new data related to the 2020 food price crisis that we experienced. And just for historical reference, back in 2007 and 2008, when food prices increased so dramatically, we saw price protests and riots in about 40 different countries. We had at least one government, maybe 2 governments that were toppled as a result of that. So it was one of the largest instability events related to food prices that we've ever experienced. Then, of course, you had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? And that put the agriculture commodity markets in a tailspin. You saw prices rise pretty dramatically. And just based on our recording of events and following of the news, we've seen at least 25 countries experience some level of protest this year related to food prices. There's been a recent study that came out that said last year we experienced at least 12,500 instances of protest around the world related to food and fuel prices. So this is a big part of the Dangerously Hungry report and the updated material. Then all of this falls into the economic shocks bucket. The third bucket that you're going to see in the front half of the report is this competition over natural resources. And that's important because it really is a continuation of research that happened in the African Sahel predominantly back in the late 2010s related to conflicts between pastoralists and agriculturalists. So we have a lot more information now about this. You can see the rise in herder and agricultural communities, the conflict between those two communities growing pretty steadily. What happens is once pastoralists lose territory, they literally can't find green pastures. They start to come into agricultural areas, and that competition over those minimal water and land resources is what leads to these sorts of localized conflicts. So there's a lot more in the Dangerously Hungry report on that topic as well. So those are the three main buckets of drivers. So across all of those buckets, those three buckets, researchers were testing individual variables, things like price increases, things like yield drops or changes. And they tested at least across all of these studies, 12 specific variables of food insecurity and linked them to at least 8 different types of conflict or instability. Things like ranging from protest and riots to terrorism all the way up to civil war. And that's what you find in the first half of the report.
So you mentioned that food insecurity on its own is not a direct driver of conflict. So talk a little bit about some of the other influences that come into the mix that make food security become volatile when added to them.
Yeah, and I can't reinforce enough that food insecurity alone is never going to be a driver of conflict in a vacuum, right? One of the greatest predictors of conflict that we have is a history of it. In a country that's experienced violent conflict in the past is more likely to experience conflict going forward. That's just the nature of these sorts of crises and human nature. But what I can say is that it is helpful to think about individual motivators in 3 buckets, right? One is desperation. The second is grievances, and the third is governance. And if we take them one by one, that desperation piece is what we talked about earlier. This is the opportunity cost of engaging in violence. If someone cannot feed themselves or their family, then they are more likely to be motivated by some sort of financial incentive to join a particular violent movement or extremist group or rebel organization, etc. So this desperation thing is really an important individual motivator. Now, the other ones are a little bit more complicated. Grievance motivator speaks to the ways in which a society tends to cleave along pre-established lines. If there are very clear ethnic divisions in a country, for example, or if there's a country that's already teetering on civil conflict or heading in that direction, food insecurity can be a threat multiplier, can be the straw that breaks the camel's back, that forces society into some sort of rupture or break. So the grievance motivator is, I think, a really important one. Within the grievance motivator as well, we also have to talk about the ways that food price changes in particular can cause some groups to come together, right? If there's a change in food prices for a key staple crop in a country, a crop or a food product with cultural significance, think bread in the Middle East, tortillas in Mexico, pasta riots in Italy, those sorts of things have a way of coalescing communities, of bringing them together, right? Where it would overcome divisions, where all of these groups would take to the streets or they would rebel or they would protest simply because these are products that are of cultural significance that cuts across class, hierarchy, and ethnic groups. So that's an important element of the grievance conversation. The third individual motivator is governance. So much of somebody's motivation to get involved in conflict or to produce instability or become violent has a lot to do with perceptions of government. And what that means is, someone may believe that a government failed to respond to a genuine food security emergency. Some people may believe that they responded inappropriately, or they didn't provide a sense of justice when food insecurity occurred, or they failed to provide a social safety net for people who had nothing else. So the governance piece is a big individual motivator, and you find that a lot of people are motivated to join extremist organizations because of a failure in government or a lack of trust in government. It's also true that rebel organizations and extremist organizations are likely to try to set up parallel structures to the state, right? To claim supremacy over peoples sense of justice, or they're meeting their basic needs through safety net. ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, all of these organizations are known to set up parallel social structures to be able to provide things to people and claim that they can do it better than a government, for example. So all of that falls into the government's motivator. When you combine drivers and motivators, those individual motivators we talked about and those 3 buckets of drivers that we talked about earlier, that creates the stew for food-related instability. That creates the context in which these things can occur. So it's really important.
Dangerously Hungry is the follow-up to Winning the Peace. It really looks at the last 5 years and what's happened since the initial report. Looking forward, bringing out your crystal ball a little bit, 5 years from now, where do you anticipate this conversation will be, and what will we be talking about then?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, there's probably, again, we're in this story of 3s, but I think there are 3 main themes that we're going to be having conversations about in the coming years. The first is urbanization. And, since I've been in the food security space, I've always known food security or food insecurity to be a rural phenomenon. And a lot of this changed with COVID-19, right? For the first time, because of the widespread impacts of the pandemic, people in low and middle income countries living in urban areas were disproportionately affected by the economic fallout. So we had people in those spaces who were experiencing hunger, many for the first time in their lives. We know that food price riots are more common in places that are import dependent, that are highly urbanized, right? And places with permissive government structures that allow for things like protests, right? So these things are going to happen in those settings, and they're more likely to happen now because of the higher levels of urban hunger that we're experiencing. So I think urbanization is going to be a continued trend in the food-related instability space, and one that we're going to want to watch pretty closely. The other bit of this is food assistance itself and the role of food assistance in conflict settings. We know that providing food assistance to people who cannot feed themselves or their family does provide improved social cohesion. It can build trust in local government entities and in humanitarian actors. Those things are really important, and providing assistance in those settings should be something that we continue to do. But it's also true that when you inject resources into a conflict of any variety, there are risks associated with that. And so organizations like the World Food Program and other humanitarian organizations increasingly are going to need to look at the conflict sensitivity of their programming and making sure food is ending up in not only the right hands, which is something these organizations take very seriously already, but also just trying to make sure that there aren't broader impacts of that assistance on conflicts that allow it to continue to endure or complicate those environments. The other piece is food as a weapon of war. And we've talked about some advances in this literature in Dangerously Hungry, but I believe that in the next couple of years, we actually have to test international humanitarian law, international human rights law, to make sure that we can take action against individuals who are involved in so-called starvation crimes. And I think this is going to be something that researchers, people in the legal community, and governments are going to have to look at more closely. What happens when humanitarian actors are denied access to hungry people? What happens when somebody infringes on the sovereignty of another country and causes a global food price crisis as a result of that? How do we hold people accountable in the current international regime?
Well, Chase, thank you so much for taking the time to talk through the report with us. I know I've really benefited from reading it, and I hope that those on the video today will take the time to go to wfpusa.org, look at the report, and if you have questions, engage with us through social media. So thank you, Chase, and look forward to what's next.
Thank you very much.